The Prophecy. Written and narrated by Althea Little. Chapter 2. Amelia grabbed her clipboard hanging from the door and turned the knob. "Hello, Mr." Her eyes flew up, not trusting the name on the page, no matter how neatly it had been written. "Osric." The name came out in a breathless whisper. Recovering, she quickly willed her face into a cool mask of indifference, but her heart beat against her ribs. His smile faltered for a second before growing wider. "Amelia!" He drew out her name as if they were old friends who hadn't had the pleasure of seeing each other in a long while, as opposed to what they really were, old friends who now hated one another. "Look at you! You're a healer now?" He studied her for a moment, no doubt taking in the spotted apron and the dirt under her nails. "I have to say, I am a little surprised. I would have thought you'd become an apothecarist or herbalist, but this uniform suits you." She tried not to narrow her eyes at his jab, and despite her dreams of becoming an apothecarist, his comment about her profession had to be a jab. He always knew how to get under her skin, and he knew that her proficiency with plants and potions was seen as a deficiency by the rest of her class. Earth mages were supposed to be as strong and unmovable as the rocks they wielded. Her power had manifested differently than most. Instead of manipulating rocks and metals, she was able to manipulate plant life. Her skills were seen as weak by others in her class. She was seen as weak. And despite not being an earth mage himself, he never let her forget it growing up. "I see you're as charming as ever, Osric." Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she looked him over, her expression full of disdain. He looked different from the last time she had seen him. His once thin, scrawny body was now filled in with lean muscle that she could see even under his white guard's uniform. She hated to admit it, but the muscle suited him. He'd been adorable when he was young and scrawny, but she'd bet that now, outside of the guard's uniform, he'd be devastating. She tried not to let her mind linger on the image of his tanned bared chest, but the image seemed to be locking itself away in her memory. Moving up to his face, she saw the familiar light brown hair now cut short on his head. She wondered if the sunlight still brought out streaks of red and gold. Probably. His eyes were still the same deep shade of blue, but instead of looking at her with kindness as they had in their childhood, or spearing her with the anger that filled him in his teenage years, they looked at her with confusion. She scowled. Of course the goddess would make him handsome as an adult. It simply wouldn't be cruel enough to match his face with his personality. "I meant that as a compliment, Amelia. I always thought your ability with plants were amazing." "Well, you sure had a funny way of showing it." Sighing at the bite in her words, she took a deep breath. She would not let Osric's presence turn her into that hurt teenage girl she used to be. She hadn't interacted with him in over 7 years. She was a woman now, a professional, and he was her patient. She looked at his chart. She needed to get this over with and send him on his way. "It says here that you are experiencing some pain in your left ankle. When did the pain start?" "About 30 minutes ago. I was out with a friend in the mist. Things got a little heated, and I fell and twisted my ankle. It's nothing serious, but my friend insisted I see a healer." She looked up from the chart. "Is your friend injured as well?" "Not that I'm aware of. I think she's more concerned with having hurt a member of the guard." He chuckled, shaking his head. She. So that's why he hadn't gone to the guard's personal healers. He probably wasn't even supposed to be out there, especially not with a woman. "Were you on duty during this heated moment?" His mouth lifted into a smirk and his eyes danced.
"Will that information help with the healing process?"
he asked, voice dropping to a teasingly seductive whisper. It sent bolts of awareness through her, but she quickly shut the feelings down. "Fair enough. That's none of my business." Placing the clipboard on a small table near the door, she turned back to him. "Roll up your pant leg so I can examine the injury."
"These uniform pants are a bit difficult to roll up. It might be easier if I just take them off."
He reached for the top of his pants. Amelia's hand shot out, blocking him from her view. That won't be necessary. A blush slowly made its way up her neck. She cleared her throat and tried to settle her fluttering heart. Sounding as matter-of-fact as possible, she said, I can cut a line up the bottom of your pants if you can't roll them up. She knew she was being uncivil. She would have never said that to another patient. She was trained to deal with patients in all manner of dress. But there was just something about him that irked her. Perhaps it was all the years of teasing. Perhaps it was something else. She really didn't care to examine it. Osric gave a small smile before rolling his pant leg halfway to his calf. He hadn't been lying. He actually did struggle to get the pants even that high. Once his pants were in place, he motioned for her to begin. Professional, she told herself. I am a professional. Amelia bent down and lightly touched Osric's wounded ankle. She ignored the familiar spark that ran through her body when their skin touched, and began chanting the spell that would allow her to feel how deep the wound ran. She closed her eyes and tried to concentrate on the reverberations of the magic as it worked its way through his ankle. Her concentration was broken when Osric said,
My parents haven't stopped talking about you, you know.
Amelia opened her eyes and reluctantly looked up at him.
Yours still pester you?
Refusing to have this conversation while she was crouching before him, she stood and let out a frustrated breath through her nose. Of course they still pestered her. In fact, Amelia hadn't been surprised by the fact that Osric was now a guard. She was told about it long before today, and her parents still brought it up every chance they got. Have you heard? Her mother had said 2 years ago. Osric was accepted to the Mist Guard. He's so brave. Don't you think, Millie? Yeah, so brave, she had muttered. In reality, she was sure he only joined as a way to impress women. There hadn't been any conflict within or against Indale in over 200 years, and the Mist was mostly stable. Not much magic had to go into keeping it up as far as she knew. Osric was nothing more than a slacker jerk with a charming smile. You would think that after 12 years they would give up already. She shook her head. She didn't want to think about this, much less talk about it. Turning back to the table, she picked up her clipboard and began scribbling her findings. She spoke as she wrote. It looks like there's nothing wrong other than a slight bruise to the bone. I'll give you a tincture for the pain. Take it for the next couple of days and you should be good to go. She signed her name to the report with an annoyed flourish. With that done, Amelia pulled a vial of orange liquid out of her bag and placed it in Osric's outstretched hand. She opened the door and stepped aside for him to exit. As they walked to the front of the clinic, she looked straight ahead. With a neutral tone, she stated, Please send your parents my regard and let them know that, respectfully, my thoughts on the prophecy have changed since I was a girl, and I am no longer interested. Osric looked at her. He seemed surprised by that, though she couldn't understand why, not after what he had put her through. It looked like he wanted to say something, but he was interrupted by a woman hurrying toward them. Oz! She called. The two of them looked over, and Amelia noticed that his friend was beautiful, with long, wavy red hair and a short, flowy green dress. Are you all right? She asked, placing her hand on his shoulder. It was such a soft gesture, and her lovely voice was full of concern. Amelia found herself irrationally jealous. Not just of how beautiful this woman was, but that she felt comfortable touching him with care and calling him by a nickname that Amelia had once called him so many years ago. He reassured her that he was fine, but the woman didn't seem convinced and turned to Amelia.
Is he really okay, or is he just acting manly?
Amelia had to smile. This woman seemed like someone she could be friends with. Oddly enough, she was jealous of that too. He really is okay. Just a bruised ankle, and perhaps a bit of bruised pride. The woman grinned at Amelia and turned to Osric, pushing his shoulder. He winced as he was forced to put pressure on his bruised ankle.
That's what you get for making it sound like you were dying. I thought your ankle would surely be broken.
She rolled her eyes at him and then turned back to Amelia.
Thank you for helping him.
Amelia nodded. The familiarity between the two of them made her jealousy rise even higher. She didn't want to feel like this, especially not when it came to Osric. She turned to Osric and gave him a curt nod before turning away. She wanted to get away from these two.
"Millie?"
Osric called after her, sounding as confused as she felt. She didn't turn around, not when her heart reacted so fiercely to her old nickname. She just held up her hand in goodbye and said, "Feel better." That's the end of this chapter. Thank you for listening. If you would like to read the story without narration or would like to follow along, head over to www.wattpad.com/user/Althea_little. New chapters are added every Wednesday, so be sure to hit the subscribe button. And if you like this chapter, give it a thumbs up and consider buying me a coffee, linked in the description. All donations are greatly appreciated. Until next time, stay magical.